Hello and welcome to episode 449 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's good to be back. We had another short break from the podcast. I mean, it's unusual to have a break or two breaks this early on in a year, but it was half term. We spent time with our families. Well, I say we did. I did. You didn't, did you, Andy? Not as much as you probably could have done.
I knew this would come up on the podcast. Look, I booked what I thought was going to be a lovely trip to London with my family, overnight in a hotel, go and see a couple of shows, maybe go to the cinema, walk around Leicester Square, see the sights. It wasn't to be. I still blame my wife because there wasn't anything in the calendar. I thought I would surprise my family and go on a nice trip to London during half term. I had the time off work. It seems that what had actually happened is my wife had agreed to do some dog sitting for a friend, and so we had a friend's dog to stay over. We also had our own dog to consider, so we couldn't really just palm our own dog on. The long story short is that I still went on the trip to London. And unfortunately, my family didn't. So I had a lovely time in London, hotel, overnight stay, went to the cinema, went to see a show. Oh, that makes me sound really bad, doesn't it?
All I hear is that you are blaming your wife, Lola, the office dog, who's had a friend round, and then you've gone to London as a married guy and stayed overnight in a hotel on your own and enjoyed it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm surprised you're not in the doghouse, to be quite honest, but there we go. So I did spend a bit of time with my family.
All right, don't rub it in.
Did a few things football related, actually. Went to see Tottenham, funnily enough, do a training session, which was a slightly bizarre experience because having gone to the games, you go and watch them train, and it was cheap, and it was really for the kids to be able to get close to the players. But then when it started, you just literally watching some grown men train, and there's no atmosphere. So it's slightly odd if you do go to live football matches to go to something which there is no atmosphere. But it was still good fun. Went around the shops, etc. So
what you've experienced there at Spurs, where there was no atmosphere, it's like going to watch Watford play. That's basically what I experienced watching my team play on a Saturday.
Yeah. So it's good to be back, and I'm going to go straight into one of the things that happened to me today, actually, which was related to a topic we've talked about on the podcast recently about the car finance review. So as you know, we'll link to it in the podcast notes. We did a piece on the potential review of car finance sales that were made in the past prior to 2021, and there could be some kind of conversation coming people's way. It's very early days. I'm not going to go into full details, but I did mention on a recent podcast that Martin Lewis had launched a tool that essentially helps you fire off an email to your car finance company that asks the questions whether there was a discretionary commission arrangement in the agreement. And so that's the precursor. If there is a mass mis-selling scandal in a review, then you could use that information later in the year. So what was funny about it, I actually took my car for service. So I was sitting in the waiting room. They were servicing my car while I waited. This is a car I now actually own outright, but did have finance on it a number of years ago. And while I was sitting in their waiting room and they were servicing my car, I actually filled out the tool on Martin Lewis's website and fired off an email to their finance department to ask the questions about whether I've actually had a finance agreement that had that discretionary commission arrangement in it, which felt good. It felt slightly odd. I'm not sure what the emotion was that I was feeling. It did mean that on the one hand that I never quite trust garages, so I never knew what was going to be happening out the back with my car and what sort of bill I was going to be presented with. But on the other hand, I could have been potentially setting my stall out for some sort of compensation in the future. So that was good. And on another thing, Andy, to mention tools that we do use, we don't mind if they are obviously money-saving expert tools. Any tool, if it's good, we will promote it. You used their Resolver tool recently, didn't you?
Yeah, it worked out really well for me. I won't go into the details because, one, it's very boring. But Resolver is an online service. You can use it via your phone, and it essentially gives you a quick route in to the complaints team at whichever company you need to make a complaint to, and it will handle all of the templates and everything for you and enable you to hopefully get a resolution to your complaint. I used it recently and it was excellent. I spent hours on the phone getting nowhere. Within, I would say, 10 minutes of using the Resolver feature and firing off what I needed to, within 24 hours, I had my I had my resolution. Resolver resolved it.
Resolver resolved it, and the reason it's quite interesting that we mentioned it because Andy was spending a lot of time and effort with this particular complaint that he had, and it did get resolved. And Resolver was a tool that was made quite a number of years ago, and then I think money saving experts started to back it, and then it became part of their service. So something to look at. Anyway, moving on to what's on this week's podcast, there is an investment piece. You'd be pleased to know if you invest. There is an investment piece about markets, and again a bit of a timing thing about whether markets could be turning over. Then we're also going to be doing a piece about energy. So there's been some development in the energy market, particularly around potentially fixing your bill, some interesting deals and innovations that are appearing. So you'll be interested in that, particularly if you are a British Gas customer, but even if you're not. And the final piece we're going to be doing on the podcast is relating to eSIMs. So Revolut, who are the company that many of you will know for their prepaid cards that you will use when you travel abroad for cheap currency, so you pay lower transaction fees, they have launched an eSIM. So we'll talk about what they are, how they can save you money when you're travelling abroad, when you use your mobile phone, because I think now going forward, this market is something that you're going to probably be hearing more and more about. It will come into the mainstream more, and it'll be one of the things on your checklist alongside checking whether you've got your money for when you go away on holiday. I think people are going to be looking at whether they can get a cheap eSIM.
Okay, so let's start with the first piece on this week's podcast then, investing.
Yeah, I've just realised, Andy, I never told you what that investing piece was going to be about. We normally talk before the show, so Andy was looking at me rather blankly. What's the YouTube videos? Because these are going out on YouTube now if you want to watch us doing the show and watch me and Andy occasionally stare rather blankly at each other.
I think it's time we should release some of our outtakes as well, because there are quite a few.
I'm not sure the world is ready for those. But investing, I'm going to be talking about something called Dow Theory. Now, it is a cornerstone of technical analysis. So people who listen to our market updates that we do or the podcasts in the past know that we do like to look at technical analysis. So it's looking at data, so charts, to try and determine a potential future path for markets. So think of it like looking at weather reports, looking at cold fronts, warm fronts, pressure numbers, all these sorts of things they use to make an assessment, a forecast of what the weather's going to be doing over the next few days, few weeks. So technical analysis is like the equivalent for stock markets in particular. So the Dow theory was developed by Charles H. Dow, who happened to be the co-founder of Dow Jones and Company, and also was influential in the development of the Wall Street Journal. So he was somebody who, in the world of investing, was a pioneer. And actually, the Dow theory and what he was doing goes back to the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century. So we're talking about something that was nearly 130 years ago. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, people will know, they may have heard of that particular index. It's in America. So you have the S&P 500, you have the Dow Jones that people normally refer to. That's the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's normally the other key index that people follow. And then there's the NASDAQ 100 typically, which is really tech heavy. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average, that was created in 1896, and it's probably one of the oldest and most widely followed stock market indices in the world, and it consists of 30 prominent companies in the US. So it's a good representative of the US economy. And there's also the Dow Jones Transportation Average. And the original version of that was established back in 1886, and it includes 20 major transportation companies that reflect the sector's sort of economic importance. And so those indices, they do change, the companies within them do change from time to time. And to give you a good example, actually Amazon is joining the Dow Jones Industrial Average. If I say the Dow Jones, I'm talking about the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So that is actually getting a bit of a tech component, which is going to be quite interesting. And that's, I think, from next week. So it's quite timely that I'm talking about it. Now, I mentioned those two indices because they're quite important to this whole Dow theory that I'm going to be talking about. And it's really talking about whether markets are going to change a trend. So maybe there'll be a reversal. So if markets are high, are we going to see them slump? And vice versa. So you can use this Dow theory. Now, before I carry on, if you want to look at these stock markets on your phone, because people do quite like to follow them, if you've got an iPhone, if you search DJT in your stock app, if you've got an Android, you must have an equivalent app. It will be the similar thing. That will be the Dow Jones Transportation Average. If you search DJI, you'll find the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So they're the two things you want to look at, because I'm going to be referring to them, and it's more about the dynamic between those two averages. Now, the concept of what we want to talk about needs a couple of principles you need to understand first of all to make it work. So one of the principles is that markets discount everything, or in other words, the share price of a company reflects everything that's known about it. And that's part of the efficient market hypothesis, which you may have heard about as well. So that is an assumption, and not everybody believes that, but it's saying that if you see a share price, that reflects everything that's known about that particular share, because people are buying and selling it based on all the information that's out there, and whatever that does, that's reflected in the price, because you don't know everything. So that was one assumption that's built into a lot of technical analysis, but into Dow Theory. The other thing that was part of it is that there were three types of trends. So there was a primary trend, which is basically the general direction where the market's going over the long term. And so that's where we talk about bull markets and bear markets. Then you've got secondary trends, which is where you're talking about sort of temporary movements that might last a few weeks or months. So those can go against primary trends. So if we get a bull market, so the market's rallying over a period of time, like we've seen over the last, say, 6 months, you'll get periods in that where you'll get dips. If you look at even going back to the financial crisis, we had the market going up for many years, but you'll have periods in there where you'll get slumps. So that could be a somewhat short-term secondary trend. And then you get minor trends, which they talk about, which are just viewed as not having much significant market noise, and it doesn't really impact the overall direction of the market. Now, what Dow Theory does is try and determine whether you're going to get a change in that primary trend, that going from a bull market to a bear market. And one of the ways it does that is to look at those two indices that I mentioned, so the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the Dow Jones Transportation Average, and see how they're behaving. Because the theory is that one of those averages, so the industrial averages, if you think about it, they're the companies that make stuff, and the transportation average contains companies that transport that stuff. So if the economy's booming and companies are making stuff, then the companies that shift it around the country are going to also be booming. And if they're in line, that reflects the overall trend that the economy is probably booming and that we are in a bull market for stocks. But if you start to see a divergence in those two things, then that's starting to show you that maybe we are moving into a new paradigm, a new slump. So if the markets are going up, that could be that we're about to see the stock markets roll over. If we are in a bear market, it could be we're about to see them rally. And what you want to look for, look at the stock market app that I mentioned earlier, look at those two indices, and you want to look at periods where there's a divergence. So one of them might be making new highs, but the other one might start be making lower lows, so it's actually starting to fall down. But you also want to see whether there's confirmation from what they call volume. So if you go to Yahoo Finance, I really like Yahoo Finance as a website. So if you put those indices that I mentioned earlier, you type those letters into Yahoo Finance, or just search for the actual full names of the indices that I mentioned, you'll find charts that are interactive and you can play about with them, and it's free. Then what you want to do is look at those charts and look on days when the index, say for example, slumps. What's the volume doing? Are we seeing more volume on days when the market is falling than when it's going up? So the volume can confirm maybe a potential change in direction. So let's say, for example, we're looking at one of the indices and it's seemingly going to new highs all the time. It's going upwards. But then when there are days where the market might pull back slightly, so down days, you're always going to get a down day, even in an uptrend. If the volume on those days is higher than what you're seeing on the other or the general up days, that's starting to suggest potentially that people are looking to sell, because as soon as there was a bit of a dip, people are piling in and starting to sell. And of course, the market closed down that day. That shows you there's a lot of selling pressure. Equally, if you're in a bear market and on the slight up days you get, there's a bit of volume or greater volume than on the down days. That's showing there is definitely starting to become more keenness for people to buy into the market. And that could also give you a hint there's going to be a change in direction. But what I want people to do is look at the two indices, compare them, and see how they tend to move in a similar direction if you've got a bull market or a bear market. And you only have to go back to recent history where you can see since the end of 2023 that they've generally moved up together. And so that paints a picture of a confirmation of the general trend. So the companies that make stuff, their prices are going up. The companies that are shifting that stuff around, their prices are going up. And of course, the prices we're assuming reflects everything that's known about these companies anyway. So there are a lot of assumptions in there. But where it's starting to get interesting, and the reason why I brought it to the podcast now, is when you get the divergence, it might start to suggest there's cracks appearing. If you look at the app right now, you will see that the Dow Jones Transportation Average has started to fall, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average has continued to go higher. And so that is starting to get people to wonder why, and they're looking to see, is this a suggestion that we're about to see markets roll over? Now, it is tricky to confirm either way, because it's not normally until the trend actually confirms that we see a rollover in both that we're now going into maybe towards a bear market. We've got a change in that primary trend. But if we look at the divergence, if it exists, and we start to look at the volumes on the down days and up days, we can start to see, yes, it looks like there's some cracks appearing in the market. Now, past history, we've seen these divergences occur at key moments. We saw it before the financial crisis. We saw it before the tech bubble burst back in 2000. We even saw it before the COVID crash in 2020. And we are starting to see some signs now. And so it's just interesting for people. I'm not saying the market is going to roll over, but we would like to see the Dow Jones Transportation Average start to pick back up again if we're going to keep pushing higher. Now, with all of these things, there is never a 100% guarantee that we're going to end up with a particular result. But when you see cracks and you see things like Dow Theory that's been going for pretty much 130 years, that has a fairly decent track record, it's something to bear in mind. So Dow Theory is something for people to look at. It's something that's interesting to look at. You're going to probably start to hear it a bit more now. You'll probably start to see articles where people are talking about this idea, because the divergence is relatively new. It's only happened in the last month. So you might start to see it, then you can say, oh, I know what that means. And you can even look at your stock market app to see how these two indices are behaving compared to each other, and to see if we do get a market slump, was the divergence correct? So I could have gone into a little bit more detail on that, but we'll put a link in the notes of the podcast if you want to find out a little bit more about Dow Theory, that you can go and read it for yourself. And I'll also put a link to those particular indices so you can go and follow them if you want and have a look on your phone or your laptop.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. Energy. Now, we've heard recently that the energy price cap is changing again from April the 1st. It's been significantly cut, which is good news for energy consumers. But just prior to that, British Gas, one of the biggest suppliers in the UK, announced a new tariff that piqued our interest because it's slightly different. And Damien, you got an email on it.
Yeah, so Andy's going to go into the details of that tariff, but it is innovative. But it was, as Andy mentioned, it was ahead of the cut, or the announcement of what the cut would be to the energy price cap, and we've seen it now fall quite significantly. So the good news is for consumers, as we talked about in the podcast previously, you're seeing your bills probably fall around, or will see them fall around about 15% come April. And for consumers, obviously most people are on the standard tariffs with their energy provider, and so they are paying the energy price cap for their bills. And there hasn't been really any decent fixed rate tariffs coming out that are actually going to be below that energy price cap. But of course, this is where we then saw some innovation from British Gas when they announced this particular new tariff. And I think going forward, we're probably going to see a little bit more from energy companies that might finally mean that people start shopping around.
And so to explain what this British Gas price promise tariff is, it's a fixed price tariff, but it has an element of flex in it. which means it can ultimately and will ultimately change come April once the energy price cap figures change. So you've got to remember this tariff was released before the energy price cap announcement was made, but their idea is they can get people in on a fixed deal with this element of flex. So what does it mean for people? It means that if they move over to this fixed deal now, they'll guarantee to save around about 12% on what the energy price cap is currently, as in from January through to March, the end of March. But then it will then flex. It will move in line with the energy price cap and come down, and they guarantee it will be at least £1 cheaper than whatever the energy price cap is come April, which we now know.
Yeah, so basically what they were doing, people wouldn't fix because they're thinking, well, the energy price cap is coming down. Because the news articles, we wrote a news article about a month ago about the prediction for energy prices over 2024.
And it wasn't too far off. I think it was about 16% cut, and it came in around about 15%, so it's pretty close.
So if you try to sell the idea of a fixed price tariff to consumers, they're more than likely going to say no. What they're doing now then is giving you're going to go into a fixed tariff, but for the next few months, we're going to guarantee you're going to go under the price cap. You're going to save. So from that point onwards, presumably then from the 3 months after April, so we're talking about the end of June, then you are on a fixed deal.
Yeah, so if you switch now, let's think we're at the end of February, we're coming into March, you're guaranteed to save money right through to the end of March. You're then guaranteed to save at least £1. All right, it's not a lot, but it changes as of the 1st of April to ensure that you're still under that energy price cap, all by a little bit. But then we've got to talk about what happens from July onwards. Now, the predictions again from Cornwall Insight suggest that energy prices will come down again in July. This flex deal, however, will not come down again. It's a one-time deal. It will flex in April to account for those energy price cap changes, but then come July, you will still be fixed at that April price. So if prices do come down again in July, as is currently predicted, you could be slightly worse off on that fixed deal. This fixed deal with British Gas runs until May 2025. So you've got to do the numbers in your head. If you think that the general trend of energy prices is going to continue to trend down, then you might be worse off fixing. But you've got to remember, you know what you'll be paying. What sort of a price do you put on the fact that you can sleep at night? And actually, if you think about the fact that it will be cheaper than the April energy price cap anyway, if you look to last year or the year before, you're still doing okay. So just to sum up on this, you will save money if you move over to the British Gas deal relative to the energy price cap for January. That's guaranteed. You'll also save money relative to the energy price cap in April, albeit just slightly, maybe £1 or so guaranteed. You then might end up paying more come July. You've got to weigh that up. But then you're locked in until May 2025 to do the numbers. It is interesting. What it does mean, and why we're bringing it to the pod, is an element of flex. Is the next company that comes out going to provide an extra 3 months of flex to incorporate the July figure? We don't know.
Yeah, so essentially you're no worse off than the energy price cap until we start getting into the summer. But then looking at the Cornwall Insight predictions for the rest of this year anyway, there's a marginal decline they're predicting in July. We're not talking about as significant as what we're seeing from January to April. We're only talking about a decline. I'm looking over your shoulder trying to do the maths in my head. It's probably only about, what?
It's going to maybe come down again by a couple of £100 over the year.
But looking at the numbers there, Andy, it's predicted to be heading back to somewhere near where they actually think it will be in April come October. So there is a small dip in the summer, but then they think it will pick up again in the winter. So it's a bit of a gamble, but if you are more worried about your prices rising next winter, you are then comfortable with the rate you would be paying come April and want to fix, then it is something that's worth bearing in mind. We do provide a roundup of all the best deals that come out on the Mater Masses website. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, so you can bookmark it in the future, because we won't necessarily cover every time someone comes up with an energy tariff, but it's because the market has changed slightly. And there's another company that's done something as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so we've talked about the fixed deal with British Gas there. That gives assurance to people they can fix at a certain price. There is another deal on the market at the moment, which is not a fixed deal. It's a tracker deal. But what it does is it guarantees to track ever so slightly under the energy price cap. So this is a deal for those people who are kind of happy where the energy price cap is, but they don't want to pay up to the energy price cap. E.ON has got a tariff called the Next Pledge. It's a tracker deal that will save you roughly over 12 months. If you go for this one, it will save you approximately £50. There are exit fees on that one, though, so you do need to be careful.
But the thing to bear in mind, because we're getting lulled into a false sense of security about the energy price cap, because in a normal functioning market where we haven't had energy prices so high, you could easily get a better deal than the energy price cap, because previously no one would have been paying the energy price cap because they would have had fixed deals that were lower than that. We're going to hopefully be heading back into that world. So just sitting on your default tariff won't be the best deal in the future. So talking about exit fees on that tariff, there are exit fees on the British gas tariff as well once we get to the fixed period, isn't there?
That's right. It's £75 per fuel. So if you're dual fuel, you would need to pay £150 to get out of that fixed deal. But what is quite interesting, what British Gas have done is they've said that they'll happily switch you to any other fixed tariff with British Gas. So if you decide, or if British Gas subsequently come out with better deals in the future, you can move over to those without penalty.
So there's, again, another nuance to that deal that makes it attractive to customers. But it's not just British Gas customers. You can be a non-British Gas customer now and move over to this new tariff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's open to all new and existing customers. So, have a look at it. Have a look at the article. We've got all the details on how it works, and we'll link to it in the show notes.
Good. So that is energy. So it's good to see there's some movement there. I'm going to move on to the next piece of the podcast, the final piece, which is to do with eSIMs. So this is something that came about this week. It seems to have blown up quite significantly. eSIMs, in particular, Revolut. So Revolut, as most people know, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, they're a company that aren't actually a bank in the UK yet, but they do provide lots of services for people who travel. Principally, you will know them for providing a prepayment card where you can get cost-effective use of money abroad. So you can actually buy and withdraw money, so you can make transactions without any fee, so minimal cost. Now, that has been incredibly attractive. Then we had the likes of Starlink, etc., who came along and also innovated that particular market. But Revolut have now come out with an eSIM. So they are entering the mobile market. So when we go on holiday, of course, there are roaming charges on a lot of tariffs. So when we go abroad. So what Revolut have done is launched this eSIM. And we'll put a link to the full news story that we produced on the Main to the Masses website. And I need to give you probably a quick explanation of what eSIMs are. So we had to look into it in quite a lot of detail. A lot of people who won't ever have heard of them. And to be honest, most of us in Main to the Masses towers weren't really aware of eSIMs. And partly that's because a lot of phones didn't used to be able to use them. So modern phones, and most phones you're probably looking at that have been out in the last few years, will allow you to use eSIM. So if you think about it, when you get a phone, you normally have to put a SIM card in it. And that has been standard for, well, as long as we've had mobile phones. But what you can now do on modern phones is have an electronic SIM. And so the eSIM, actually the E doesn't stand for electronic, it stands for embedded. And what it means is you can now download a SIM that's electronic onto your phone, and you can switch over to that SIM without having to physically change SIM cards. So what people used to do often, if they were very clued up, if they were going abroad, let's say they're going to the US, they might decide that their tariff was expensive, or the bundle they could buy to have the use of their phone abroad was expensive. They may go and buy a SIM locally when they got to the destination of their choice, and then they would swap out their SIM in their phone with this new physical SIM, and then be able to use their phone at a much reduced rate when they're abroad. That was fiddly. You'd have to go and research and find the SIM, physically make the changes, and it also means that you can't therefore use your existing number in the UK. But with eSIMs, you can in fact download a SIM, so you don't have to make a physical switch, but you can also use your existing number. So that's quite exciting. So with this new eSIM from Revolut, what you can do is before you go away, you can decide to use this eSIM, you put it on your phone, and then you can just flick over to it while you're away, while leaving your existing SIM still in the phone itself. Your number still works, and then you can use your phone at reduced cost. And because it's based on data, you would typically, let's say, for example, go abroad. You might go to the US. You might use things like WhatsApp and things like that to be able to make calls and send messages via your data, which is included in these services. You can still receive calls, etc., on your phone as you normally would, because you've still got the same number, but you will probably be charged by your normal provider in the UK, so do bear that in mind. So the whole process is actually very straightforward. For Revolut, you can control it via the app. So if you download the app, if you go in there, you can see at the bottom there's an option that says lifestyle. You go in there, you can find details about the eSIM itself. Now, eSIMs, when you look at the numbers, they are useful if you go abroad but outside of the EU. So that's one of the big things about it, because a lot of companies do provide add-ons that you can pay for before you go away, or in the case of the EU, when you actually get there, you normally get notified, and the cost of using your phone over there is normally only a few pounds a day. So it's actually quite cost effective if you're going for a short trip. So if you look at the price of eSIMs and the use in Europe, you probably won't be better off using them. But if you start to go outside of the European Union, then you are likely to benefit from the cost savings of using an eSIM. Now, just to give you some numbers, Revolut's eSIM, when you download that and you use that, if you go to America, you can get 10 gigabytes of data that will last you for 30 days for just over £20. Whereas if you were, for example, using one of the other providers, I'm going to just use a generic one. If you used EE, for example, you would have to pay near £6 a day to get 500 megabytes of data. So if you went for a month, that is going to be basically heading towards something like £180 to use your phone for 30 days, and you can only use 500 megabytes a day. Whereas you could pay, for example, on the Revolut eSIM, you could pay just over 20 quid to get 10 gigabytes of data that would last for 30 days. So that is why they're attractive. So if you look at the cost analysis, how does the Revolut eSIM compare? It's quite difficult. The market is quite splintered. You can go online, you can find comparison sites, but you have to do a bit of research. But it's broadly in line with some of the better deals out there. You will be able to, of course, find cheaper deals if you do look around, because you can find some local SIMs that are eSIMs that can be used. Now, do bear in mind, you do have to make sure your phone can use an eSIM, because not every phone can. I'm not going to go through the list of phones that can use an eSIM. We've got an article on the Money to the Masses website that explains how these things work, gives you a list of the sorts of phones that can use them. But if you've got an iPhone that's been released in the last few years, so something probably from about an iPhone 11 onwards, you're likely to be able to use an eSIM.
Yeah, I mean, just to get them looking down the list here, have a look at the article, as I say, but all the latest iPhones, all the latest Google Pixel, all the latest Samsung Galaxy, and even if you go to Motorola, such as like Edge and Razer, and also OnePlus phones, the latest models, you're pretty good. So, I mean, most people who've got one of those latest phones, anything from about 2017, 2018 will be good.
Yeah, so it begs the question then, can you get an eSIM in the UK to use in the UK? And the reality is that most UK mobile providers don't really provide eSIMs. So you're going to be using another service from when you go abroad, more than likely. So it is possible, but most of them don't really do it. And actually, you're better off having a paid monthly contract anyway. So this is for people who are travelling abroad and want to make a saving and don't want to have to pay the expensive charges. As I mentioned, it's more likely to be a benefit for people who are going outside of the European Union. So the message is, do shop around. If you're going abroad, you will obviously look at things like Revolut, Starling, all those things when you're looking at how you are going to take your money abroad, the most cost-effective way to spend. You've now got another thing to add to the list where you can save quite a bit of money, particularly if you are going outside the European Union. You should shop around, look for eSIMs if your phone is compatible. And just to mention that, I think Revolut are trying to obviously attract customers just to try it. All customers do get 100 megabytes free of data. And if you do have the Ultra plan, so they have paid for plans, if you have the Ultra plan, you do benefit from 3 gigabytes of data each month at no extra cost, and you can use that globally. So it's something that is worth looking at, and maybe we're going to see more innovation in this space as well.
And when you're thinking about using data abroad, do also consider of where you're staying, in your hotel or in your accommodation, because you've probably got Wi-Fi access there as well. In which case, you can probably make Wi-Fi calls and take advantage of WhatsApp Live and Facebook Live and all those kind of things, Messenger. So yeah, think about how much data you'd need. You'll be surprised how little data you actually need when you're out and about, because really it's only to navigate around maybe maps or restaurants and things like that.
Yeah, I think where they need to come up with a solution is for people who go on cruises who don't get stung by all the charges. I just seem to know, I've never been on a cruise, but I seem to know a bunch of people who are going on cruises who seem to be getting stung for the cost of paying for Wi-Fi. And of course, if you're in the middle of the ocean, your phone won't work anyway, so eSIMs don't help you.
I've been on a cruise and the Wi-Fi charges are extortionate. And one of the other problems with cruises is, depending on which countries you're stopping at, some are in the EU and some aren't. So most people, when they go abroad, they go to one destination, which is either in the EU or not, and you can make a decision on what the best package is for you. But you're crossing over different sort of regions.
And of course, if you're going to a cruise that's somewhere on the other side of the world as well, you are definitely not in the European Union. So it's interesting, something to bear in mind. I think we'll probably hear from more people who are using eSIMs. I'll certainly be looking at it. If you've used an eSIM, then do write on the Money to the Masses website or email us, but also on YouTube in the comments section for this particular episode, because I'm intrigued to see or hear from people who have used them regularly and see how much they've saved, because it does seem to be something that I think will become a little bit more mainstream.
And so that's it. We are done for this week. If you do want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. You can also send me a message. It's Andy@moneytothemasses.com. I'll be particularly interested to hear any feedback from the podcast or any future ideas. We're always ears. Please do also feedback and review the podcast if you can.
Yeah, 5 stars. Has to be 5 stars. Otherwise, don't bother. I should be some more bold about these things. I'm not sure you're allowed to actually tell people, coerce them into giving you 5 stars, but hey, let's do that anyway.
Well, let's go for balance. Give us 1 star if you like.
No, we don't, because it affects our ratings. Also, do follow us on the socials, like particularly Instagram, where we are always putting out new content, and YouTube. We're doing lots of content on YouTube, doing more videos. And as we are in Q1, so it's bit of jargon, but the first quarter of the year, and it's a lot to do with investing, because it's a time of the year where people are having to use their allowances. I am reviewing a lot of products on there and updating the reviews of things like investment platforms. And I did mention Starling earlier in the podcast. I did a new video review of that product in particular. So do make sure that you do check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to it, because we are always putting out new content. And another example, switching deals. They all got pulled for switching to new current accounts. There's been 2 new ones in the last week, so do make sure you check that out.
Oh, and before we finish up, we have had a birthday, haven't we?
We've had a mini birthday. So the Money MOT is 5 years old, and if you've not done it, then do go to mot.moneytothemasses.com, where you can take it. It'll only take you a couple of minutes. You get a review of your finances, a grade of how well you're doing, and suggestions how you can improve on all areas of your personal finances. And if you haven't got the URL there, go to the Money to the Masses homepage. You can find a link to the MOT on there.
Okay, so that's it. We're done for this week. Until next time.
Until next time.